This lesson is on genetics. The learning targets are that you can construct a scientific explanation for how genetic factors influence the growth of organisms, and that you can use a model to show how genes are passed from parent to offspring. Let's get started. All right, let's start with two basic words that you guys have actually already been hearing. Heredity, we're going to define as the passing of traits from parent to offspring. So we've already been doing that. You guys did an inheritance gizmo. Inheritance is a derivative of that word, so you have some understanding of that. The second word, genetics, is kind of where we will spend our time in our last bit for this unit. And basically, we know that genetics is controlled by genes. So how those traits are inherited through the action of alleles, this is a new word today, or genes, is what we call genetics. And that's where we will end our time. And this is what this presentation is all about. We're going to start by learning about a guy named Gregor Mendel. So in this space, I want you to record at least 3 things about him. So the next several slides are all about what he did. So this guy named Gregor Mendel was known as the father of genetics, and he was basically the first person to try to explain what genes were or how organisms behaved when reproduction happens. And he did most of his studies on pea plants, and he was around in the 1800s in Austria. He was not a scientist by trade, he was a monk, so he sort of did this in his offhand time, and was not known for this while he was alive. It was discovered after he died that he did all of this work. So what he did was he basically controlled how these pea plants reproduced. He cut off the stamen and basically became the pollinator. He would take a little paintbrush and carefully control how the pollen moved from one plant to another, and thereby controlling, which plants were actually reproducing with each other. And then he studied that. He worked with many different traits of the plants, including shape of its pea and its pod, the color and the shape of seeds. Peas can be green or yellow. The height of the plant, they can be tall or short. Where the flowers grow on the plant, whether they are at the top of the stem or on the sides. And flower color, purple or white flowers in peas. So he basically studied thousands and thousands of pea plants, and he was the first to correctly describe how genes behave and how they're passed from parent to offspring. And he did all this by basically looking at his data. And so here's all the different things he was looking at in the peas, and here's the numbers of plants. And he noticed commonly that, hey, a lot of times I always get these very similar ratios, 3 to 1. And so he started wondering about that and trying to explain it. So from there, he basically came up with some rules of inheritance. So he basically called these forms of the gene that he was studying alleles. That's how we say this, alleles, not alleles. And forms of a gene, at least in peas, it can kind of be one or the other, right? For instance, pea plants can be tall or short, dwarf. That's the height of their stem. Those are 2 forms that the gene for height can take. Those are alleles for height. He also deduced that the number of alleles an organism has is determined by what kind of cell they are. So if you're a sex cell, an egg or a sperm, you only get 1 copy of an allele, 1 form of a gene in your chromosomes. If you're a body cell, then you have 2 forms or alleles for a single gene. So there's other words we can use for this. Haploid and diploid are ones you might hear, but right. Gamete cell is a sex cell, egg or sperm, just 1 copy. Somatic means body, so any other body cell that we look at will have 2 copies of alleles because it was formed through sexual reproduction, basically, combining of 2 parent DNAs. Okay, so of those 2 alleles, how they act toward each other can be different. One might be dominant over another. So if this happens, the dominant gene always gets expressed. The only way to not show a dominant gene is to only have recessive traits. So dominant traits will always be expressed and will mask a recessive trait, And a recessive trait can only be expressed if there are no dominant alleles present. You guys saw this with the alien gizmo, right? In this example, the straight antenna is dominant. So in this situation, the parents each passed on a dominant gene, or at least one of the parents did, so that they have a baby that has straight antenna. In this situation, we've got one straight antenna parent and one curly antenna parent, which is recessive. But here, definitely, the baby is carrying both genes because each parent was able to give one, but he is showing the straight antenna because that's what's dominant. He is carrying the second parent's recessive allele, though. The only way to get curly antenna in this situation was to have, well, not, I shouldn't say the only way, the most likely way is to have two curly antennaed baby or parents, and then you'll get a curly antennaed baby. You can also get it if you were to breed this organism, right? Some of its babies, if you had a similar parent that's a hybrid, will have the curly antenna gene show up. So let's use a simple example with eye color. And I'm making eye color much simpler than it actually is because there's multiple genes that control your eye color. However, if we just take one basic example, we know that brown eyes is dominant and blue is recessive. So a person can have a brown allele and a blue allele in their genes, but they're going to have brown eyes because the brown eyes gets expressed and it covers up the blue allele that they're carrying. If you want to know more about eye color, there's a great link that I posted in the assignment in Canvas that tells all about eye color. And we will talk more about eye color. Eye color is more complex than we are making it. Now, some other things to know about how we model this process in people or in organisms to study it. So anytime, and you have this referenced in the Bill Nye video, anytime we are going to represent a dominant allele, we use capital letters. And anytime we have a recessive allele, we use lowercase letters. So now just a couple things about that. One, you'd probably want to use letters that look distinct from each other as capitals and lowercases. So for instance, R is a good one. B, it's less easy to use things that look the same capitalized as lowercase, like C or O or W or S. You can do it, then you just have to pay attention to size to really show the difference. Anyway, because you inherit a trait, an allele, from each parent, each organism is always represented by two letters, one for each allele. So for instance, in eye color, you could either have two R's, two capitals, two dominant genes. You could have one of each, dominant and recessive, one capital, one lowercase, or you could have two recessives. Now, some other vocabulary comes around because of what we just said. So if you are an organism that have two alleles of the same trait, either two dominants or two recessives, then you are what we consider purebred or homozygous for that trait. And if you are someone who has two different alleles or genes for the same trait, then, and you get two different letters, capital and lowercase, then we call that situation hybrid or heterozygous. Okay, zygous is referring to the zygote. Homo means two of the same. Hetero means two different. So we can also call this situation being a carrier, and they reference that in the alien gizmo. Also in this situation, we don't use two different letters. When we're talking about the same trait, for instance, eye color, we would use the same letter the entire time, just upper and lower case. There is a situation where you might do this using two different letters, but we're not likely to get into that here at middle school. Okay, so whatever alleles the organism has is called its genotype. So for instance, that could be any of those letter combinations that we talked about. Two dominant, dominant recessive, two recessives. That's its genotype, what we write letters of the alphabet for. Phenotype is what physically shows up in the organism determined by its genotype. The way that I always remembered this was by the letters, PH for physical, PH for phenotype. So the example here would be eye color. If we're talking about eye color, that's the phenotype. That's the physical trait that shows up because of the genotype. Okay. So we'll use my family as an example. This is an old picture from obviously when I was in college. My parents lived in England, and we went to see the Eiffel Tower. So can't totally tell from the picture, but my mom has blue eyes. So based on what you know about our previous example, what is her genotype? Hopefully you said 2 recessive, little b, little b. My dad has brown eyes. We know brown is dominant. What are his possible genotypes? So because he's brown, he has to have at least 1 capital letter. He could have 2 capital letters, or he could have 1 of each. And you don't know what he is until you look at me. So you could look at his parents as well, but you don't have them to look at. So you look at me, I have blue eyes. So I have to be BB like my mom. Well, in order for that to have happened, then my dad has to have big B, little b. Because in order for me to have a little b, 2 little b's, I had to get 1 from each parent. So in his body, his blue allele gets covered up by his brown allele, but he's still carrying it and can pass it on. My sister has brown eyes, so you know that she has to be big B, little b like my dad, because my mom can only give the blue gene, and my dad gave her his brown gene. In my family, my husband and I both have blue eyes. So that will tell you what our children would have, and we sort of knew this before we ever had our children, but there's no brown alleles to pass, so our children just have blue eyes. Everybody's little b in our family. In Miss Strong's family, her and her husband both have brown eyes, which would be a capital B, but you don't know what their other allele is until you look at their daughters. So she has 2 daughters. And what do you notice about their eye color? So in her family, she has a child with brown eyes and a child with blue eyes. So what does that tell you about her and her husband's genotype? If she's able to have a child with blue eyes, that must mean that they are both heterozygous, big B, little b. This daughter got a brown gene from someone. We're not sure what her other gene is. She could have gotten 2 browns or a brown and a blue. This daughter got 2 little b's for blue. There's a whole good website on this that's linked on eLearning. It's called What Color Eyes Will My Children Have? And I can send that to you guys when this presentation is over, but it explains this better. There's actually more than 1 gene that controls eye color. There's actually 2 at least, we think. So they explain this here. One's on chromosome 19 and one's on chromosome 15. So it talks about how you could possibly have green eyes and all of that.
I don't know. Maybe the father was a tabby. Dear Tim and Moby, both my parents have brown eyes, and I have blue eyes. How can that happen? From Emily P. Well, this is just a guess, but I'll bet one of your grandparents has blue eyes. Stop that. The color of your eyes is a factor of heredity, the passing down of physical traits from parents to children. That includes things like hair type, eye color, bone structure, and even parts of your personality. These traits are carried in our genes. Genes are made up of DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is arranged in pairs of strands called chromosomes. In humans, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in each cell. That's 46 chromosomes in all. Just about every cell in your body has these 46 chromosomes in it. You can think of them as a computer program for your body. Because everybody's different, no 2 sets of DNA are alike. You get your genes from your parents, 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 chromosomes from your father. Your parents got their genes from their parents, and so on. The genes from your parents combine to form your genes. Organisms that reproduce sexually, like people, have special cells just for making offspring. In animals, male sex cells are called sperm, and female sex cells are eggs. Sex cells are special because they have only a half set of genes. If your mother has brown eyes and your father has blue eyes, the chances are your eyes will be brown. This is because the genes that code for blue eyes are recessive, and the genes that code for brown eyes are dominant. That means that in most cases, the gene for brown eyes will block out the gene for blue eyes. You still have the blue-eyed genes in your DNA, they're just not expressing themselves. By the same logic, two parents with brown eyes might be carrying recessive blue-eyed genes. If a sperm containing this recessive gene comes together with an egg containing the recessive gene, the brown-eyed parents can make a blue-eyed baby. Really? Huh. Well, I guess you're right. Moby says that the genetic process that determines your eye color is a little bit more complicated than this. It actually involves several genes, not just one. But it's a good example of how traits are passed down from generation to generation. Of course, it's important to remember that genes don't determine everything. What we look like is largely determined by the genes we inherit, but factors like environment and nutrition can play a role too. For example, modern humans are taller on average than our ancestors because of better nutrition. But it's hard to overestimate how much our genes shape who we are. Are my parents nerds? Well, my dad, why do you ask?
You may have already picked up the fact that we're using probability to help us understand the chances of something happening. In this case, the something is how genes are getting passed from parent to offspring. So if we compare that to, flipping a coin, there's only two sides of a coin. You're going to land on one of those two sides. So that's 1 out of 2, or 50% of getting a heads or a tails. The thing is that you don't always get 50%. If you flip a coin 10 times, am I only going to get 5 heads and 5 tails? Probably not. I need to flip it a whole bunch of times. My predictions are going to get more accurate when I use probability the more trials that I run. So that's what made Mendel so effective, is that he worked with so many pea plants, thousands and thousands of them, and his predictions, the things that he thought were going to happen, often came true with the number of plants that he was experimenting on. So you will use this idea of probability in conjunction with a Punnett square, and we will talk about Punnett squares in a couple things. We can also say that gender determination, being a boy or a girl, is also 50-50, like coin flipping. And we're going to use that to simulate gender determination in the next activity. If you remember, girls have 2 X chromosomes. So when the eggs are produced, all of them carry the X gene, because that's what moms pass on. Boys have XY chromosomes. This is the 23rd chromosome. So when sperm is created, half of it will carry the X chromosome and half of it will carry the Y chromosome. So when fertilization happens, half the time X and Y will combine and you'll produce a boy. Half the time you get 2 X's and that will be a girl. So if you look at a karyotype here, this is a picture of someone's chromosomes. The 23rd set determines gender. This person's a boy because they have an X and a Y. This person's a girl because they have 2 X's that look alike, no Y. So here again, you can see how a female would produce, this is meiosis. She learned about how we make sex cells. Because there's 2 X's on that parent cell, only X's can end up in these potential eggs, right? These will all become eggs. So boys, you get your X chromosomes from your mom. Girls, you get X chromosomes from your mom too. Boys, because they have an X and a Y, when the meiosis happens and you make sperm, 2 of the 4 will be X's, 2 of the 4 will be Y's. These 2 sperm could combine with an egg to become girls, females. These 2 sperm could combine with an egg and become males. So we don't always see that ratio in a family because families are pretty small generally. But if you look at a big family, like maybe you've seen the Dugars, 19 and counting, it's on TLC Network. They have a very large family, 19 children. And if you count them up, I think there are 11 girls and 8 boys. So still not 50-50, but closer.